Well, I actually just wanted to ask you a question. So I probably didn't need the microphone. Oh, no, that's okay. What I wanted to ask you is about, you know how you were saying when you came younger and certain things, you know, were of concern to you and so on. How much of what you learnt in terms of language was a support for your family? Because what my understanding is, and what we understand, so I do some work in Dandenong, is that it's actually the kids who are actually translating a lot of the information back to their parents. Their parents are actually, you know, they might be watching international television or whatever, so they may not be getting the messages, but the kids do via a multitude of sources, their phone, their friends. And so it's their understanding and translation that goes back to the parents. And some of those messages can be maybe misaligned.
I will answer in a second to see if our guests want to ask a question before I...
Children interpreting for their parents in this country.
In some of the work where I've gone into classes with newly arrived kind of refugee children, that was a big thing, and that they were taking messages back from the classroom to their families, speaking and in their first language, explaining, interpreting the concepts that were being taught to them. As some students got older, though, and I've just written a paper about this, that you know, it's important for communities to have social capital and to bond together to communicate messages in ways that make sense to them. But some younger kind of teenage or early 20 university students there was so much pressure placed on them to do that, that they were finding that time was being taken away from them to do things they really wanted to do, like study and get a job. So there's you know, I think when kids are younger, that's great, but sometimes when there's only a few people in the community and the community's small, that can be onerous.
Exactly, and add another layer to that is when the kids take over, the role of the parents diminish. So the parents have to rely on the kids, and especially the father figure doesn't exist anymore after that, and family violence will start, or alcohol will start, and all that. So I agree 100%, and you can add layers and layers of that.
I'm Bridget from the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience. As a previous teacher, so I had been in primary schools for the last 8 years, I think that there's real opportunity, not necessarily to put the onus on kids to deliver these messages home, but to think about school as that community hub as well, where you've got some really good trust-based relationships usually between teachers and kids as well. So trying to look at how schools work with the community in terms of delivering community education and engaging with emergency services and agencies as well. I know in Dandenong there's been a lot of good work done around creating a hub that's really heavily involved with a cluster of schools in that area, because I think there's a lot of expertise as well in the teaching profession in terms of how to communicate lessons best with students from cultural and linguistically diverse backgrounds, including refugees. So yeah, I think there's a lot of expertise that can be used to inform the community, because what you've got in a school is you've got all the kids there, like you've got a full cross-section of your community there, so that you don't have to worry so much about, am I catering for this vulnerable group or that vulnerable group, to some extent, because you have all kids at school. So I think that's a really good opportunity to make links, particularly with these communities.
Can I make a comment? Can you hear me? Is that right? Just that question around children going home, and also community. What we've found in our area is that a new arrival is greeted by lots of people, and visiting is quite intense. And so there's a huge community of support for new arrivals. When you look at a refugee, they're not isolated. And it's not a closed community, it's an open community. the support that people experience once they've been here for a little while, it can often be quite strong. And yet within that, there will be people who are isolated because they've done something that offends the other people, or they don't quite belong to the same group. So the Ethiopian in our community doesn't have as many links as the Congolese and the Bhutanese and the other communities, because there's no other Ethiopians there. So there are isolated people, but I think the strength of the community is something that we really also need to be tapping into.
Thank you. We've got 5 minutes left before afternoon tea, so we'll have 3 more questions. So, one.
I'm Catherine. I've just recently started with DELP but have a linguistics degree, so this is my nerd alert. I'm wondering if the panel could talk about the challenge that I've certainly picked up in translated publications and the assumptions we make around people's literacy levels in their spoken language. And I know there's been some research that DFAT had done around literacy levels in spoken language and the technical difficulty in some of the documents we are getting translated. And if you could maybe just speak to that, because literacy and those sorts of things are, you know, a real challenge, and I'd really appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah, great question. Thanks. And I guess when we went into the Karen community, they chose a film because that could overcome some of those literacy issues. And similarly, when we worked in the African community in Adelaide, they chose a film as well because it was you didn't need to be able to read. You could just listen, and most people can understand their first language in a film. And it was engaging on those other levels of communication as well. When people recognise community leaders in films, they are more likely to keep watching. So I agree. And you know, some of those obviously literacy problems in different communities will be different in every community. So I guess the community-based approach that we use addresses that by going and saying, well, what is the best channel? What is the best mode of communication to be using? And what is the best mode to overcome literacy issues? Which is another problem I have with fact sheets. It's not just about the interpretability of the English, it's about relying on people to be able to read and to access them if they're online.
Australia has a culture of reading and forms, but some countries not. So when you give them a fact sheet, even if it's in their own language, half of them don't read it. So it's better to get it explained in a different circumstance, a different way. So, yeah.
And also, just because they speak Swahili doesn't mean this Swahili is the Swahili they speak. So it's an extreme example of American English as opposed to British English.
Hi, I'm Kathy. I work for the Victorian Foundation for Survivors of Torture, which is working with refugee and asylum-seeking families. Just a comment about children being interpreters. That might be okay, except for the role confusion, for things like what are we going to buy at the shop. But if we're talking about preparedness and adult conversations about planning, their level of English isn't going to be appropriate to do that translation. They won't have the words in their own language. I'll just mention it. The community that we're not talking about, we're talking a lot about some sort of established refugee background people, but there's a number of people in our community who are seeking asylum, and I think the situation is even it's quite different, isn't it? I'm just interested in what you think about that because of the uncertainty that they're living with.
Yeah. You know.
Chronic unsafety,
Yeah.
lack of safety. And I think it's systemic and it's perpetrated from above by authority. Deliberately, it's a policy process. And how they respond in disasters would be just... I don't think that we're not talking about them. I think it's really important because the disaster will just make it even worse for them.
And yeah, following on from that, I think some of my interviews with people on bridging visas, it's kind of very odd to walk into a room with people who are worried about whether they're going to be deported next week or their families are not going to be able to come and what's happening to their families in a war-torn area. And then you come in and talk about the risk of heat waves. on a hierarchy of risk in their minds, heat waves are pretty down the bottom. So they've got lots of other stuff to be worrying about, and there's no answer to that question. I just think it's a bit logical to be worried about what's going to happen to your life, where you're going to be sent back or stay in Australia first before other things.
But they also may be like the man in the music video that we saw walking through the disaster going on around him. They may be so wrapped up in their own stuff, they just don't see what we see. Up the back.
We're running short on time, so we can take 2 more. That's it. Sorry about that. So there's one here.
This is actually only, it's not actually a question, it's more of a comment from an experience, in that sometimes those of us who can speak the English language very well, or those of us that are not necessarily familiar with some of the people that we are dealing with in a community safety environment, we can make a judgment very, very easily that based on skin colour, their facial, however we want to see them, that they automatically cannot understand our English language. And that can be a very, very dangerous place to go, because you actually risk offending that person, because they've probably spent quite a fair bit of time in actually trying to understand the English language, understanding what we are in Australia. So having learnt from personal experience of making a misjudgment and that person taking obviously offence to it, you then have to backpedal, apologise. But even still, at the end of the day, you've actually hurt their pride. And their pride is so strong because they've been working so hard. I don't know whether you agree with me or disagree with me, but I suppose I've changed my tact very differently in the way that I approach. I never presume. I actually get them to ask me, because you will say to them, do you have any family members that would like this particular literature I've given you in another language? And if they say no, that's it. Mm-hmm. You don't keep going. You just accept that they can understand it and leave it at that.
Sounds like a valid and sensible approach.
Chap up the back.
Where's my handcuffs when I need them?
Thank you. Just making a quick comment, John Richardson from Red Cross. We've had a program which we've run in our Queensland office, which has been joint between our migration support program and emergency services, and is actually sort of working with asylum seekers, and it was actually co-designed with a group of volunteers drawn from the asylum seekers. It's been written up, so we'll get that shared. But one of the really fascinating things about it was the capacity within the asylum seekers, who I think are actually the most vulnerable people in the community because they have nothing. But their willingness to contribute, or wanting to contribute, because they have been given a place of haven, even though there's a whole uncertainty, they really wanted to be involved in this. And those who have had their status resolved, we've found that they've actually continued on and become volunteers and wanted to do a whole bunch of other stuff. So there is, it certainly is. We've done some work around engaging that particular challenging group.
I think also one of the things about mental health is a balance of positive and negative, and for many people, if there's a lot of negative, they will balance it themselves with positive and contributing. They balance their helplessness with actually being active and contributing.
Well, thank you everyone for attending and listening. Thank you, Dr. Penny and Dr. Scott. Appreciate your presentation, and thank you for the presenters that weren't here. Thank you for the questions, and hopefully you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Good.
Thanks, Mike.
Look forward to seeing your work.
Yeah, you too. Good. Thank you.